Hey, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings here on Now TV. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. I just really appreciate the fact that you have decided to join me this morning. I'm so thrilled that on YouTube, where these are being posted now, the viewership count is steadily climbing. So I truly appreciate that. You know, here just recently, I jokingly took note of the fact that when you're doing TV, even when you're doing radio, which I've done extensively in my past, you really don't know if anyone is watching. You can make, for instance, book offers, and you hope that you get response because that lets you know the statistics used to be, okay, I doubt that they're that way now, but the statistics used to be on radio that for every one response that you got, that meant that you had at least 500 to 1,000 listeners. Now again, I'm pretty sure that statistic is not valid anymore. But nonetheless, it tells you how few people will actually respond. And so when I see the YouTube number of watchers, viewers, and then when I look underneath that at the number of comments that are being made, I mean, it's just so thrilling to me because you see, those are strictly YouTube responses. That doesn't count the fact that we are beginning to get book orders, and that tells us a great deal about the viewership. And it doesn't count the fact that there are just lots and lots of you out there that are watching, and you're even watching on a regular basis, but you just haven't reached out and even said, hey, you know what? I don't agree with what you're saying, but I'm watching. That's fine, okay? I don't mind disagreement at all. In fact, disagreement can be healthy because when people respect each other and they, most of all, they respect the Word and they're willing to let the Word answer any dispute, that's fantastic. So anyway, I know based upon the YouTube viewership, I know based upon the YouTube comments, and again, that's a very limited market, so to speak. I know that there are others, who knows how many of you, that are out there who are watching and simply have not chosen to respond to us in any way. Now, don't forget, you can go to my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com, or eschatology.org, and you can send me a note. You can send me a message through my websites and say, hey, Don, I watch your Now TV videos and I appreciate them, or no, I don't agree with them. That's fine. Okay, so all of that said, thanks again for joining me here on Now TV. Now, don't forget, you want to watch William Bell on Saturday afternoons here on Now TV as well. William, in addition to being a great friend of mine, William is a fantastic Bible teacher. William has done tremendously effective work in South America. He is doing some incredibly wonderful work in Ghana and doing correspondence throughout the world. He has done Zoom meetings in Indonesia, as I have. And so William is doing a tremendous job, and he is to be commended for that. But you don't want to miss out on that. You need to pay attention and watch William Bell on Now TV on Saturday afternoons. All right. We are continuing our examination of the challenge of Christ. You do remember what that challenge is, don't you? And I shared with you a couple of weeks ago how on YouTube, or rather on Facebook, I've been engaged a number of times with people who claim to be Christians. And yet they castigate and they condemn me for saying and believing that Jesus kept his word. They criticize and condemn me for saying, here's what Jesus said, and he did what he said he was going to do, they call me a heretic, false teacher. According to these people, I'm doomed to hell. Well, you see, Jesus said, do not believe me for my words' sake. Believe me for my works. If I do not do the works which my Father gave to me, do not believe me. And so I've challenged these individuals who deny that Jesus came back when he said he was going to do, going to come. And I've said, here's the tragedy, folks. You claim to be Christians. You claim to believe in Jesus. Yet you deny that he did what he said he was going to do when he said he was going to do it. Therefore, according to Jesus' own words, according to Jesus' own challenge, we're not supposed to believe in him. And I said, the great tragedy is, Jesus said he was coming back in the glory of the Father with his angels to reward every man according to his works. And it would be in the lifetime of that first century generation that was alive at that time. And I said, the tragedy of it is you deny that he kept his word. Therefore, you are serving a liar. Or you are serving a deluded person. Or you're just simply following a failed prophet. That's all there is to it. And you know that in over 2.5 weeks of correspondence, of me issuing the challenge of Christ to these so-called believers in Christ, not one person. Do you catch the power of this? Not one person has stepped up and said, well, no, that's not true. When I have asked them, did Jesus keep his word? Not one of them has stepped up and said, well, yes, he did. Now, they will not step up and say, no, he didn't do it, because they know what that means. So instead, they have completely, totally ignored the argument. Now, what about you? How do you answer the challenge of Christ? I've shared with you on this program over and over and over again what Jesus said he was going to do and when he said he was going to do it. Do you believe his words? If you do not believe that he did what he said he was going to do, when he said he was going to do it, listen to me, and I say this kindly, I say this with as much respect as possible. If you do not believe that Jesus did what he said he was going to do, when he said he was going to do it, then you're calling him a liar. You're calling him a failure. That's not the Jesus that we want to serve. And that's not the Jesus that can save us from our sins. That's not the Jesus who could give us eternal life. That's why the challenge of Christ is so important. Now, all right, I've been sharing with you because so many people go to 2 Peter chapter 3 and they say, well, okay, I see what you're saying, but over here in 2 Peter chapter 3, Peter very clearly predicted the destruction of material creation at the day of the Lord, at the climax of the last days. Okay, if that's true, I have asked you, since Peter said that his prophecy of the last days, day of the Lord, when the Lord would come to destroy the earth and the elements that are therein, since we place that, many people, most people still do, off in our future, then since Peter said that his prophecy was based on the Old Covenant promises made by God to Old Covenant Israel, where in the Tanakh, the Old Testament, do we find the prophecy of the last days, day of the Lord, when the Lord would come to destroy creation? You know, just recently, I've just got to share this with you because it illustrates the desperation of some to avoid this parallelism between 2 Peter 3 and Isaiah chapters 2 through 5. A guy on YouTube, very, very caustic, very sarcastic, very insulting. He pops up and he said, "You're making a false argument. The day of the Lord in Isaiah chapter 2 is not the day of the Lord of 2 Peter chapter 3, because 2 Peter chapter 3 is about the destruction of the earth and the elements, but Isaiah chapter 2, 19 to 21 is only about the Lord shaking heaven and earth." And the very first time I read the argument, I must confess, I just shook my head at the utter ignorance. And again, I'm trying to be respectful. But to say these have to be two different comings because Isaiah is about the shaking and Peter is about the destruction betrays an absolute ignorance of the nature of Hebraic apocalyptic language. I pointed out to this individual that according to Hebrews chapter 12, 26 to 28, the shaking of, quote, heaven and earth signifies the removal of that which is shaken. So it's the destruction, it's the removal of heaven and earth. Well, in that context, the removal and the heaven and earth is the old covenant creation. Many commentators agree with that. Okay, so when I pointed out the nature of Hebraic apocalyptic language, this guy says, "You're being ridiculous." And I said, "No, you are ignoring the nature of Hebraic language. You are saying that unless Isaiah uses the exact terminology of 2 Peter chapter 3, then they've got to be different." And he said, the destruction of Judah, the judgment of Judah, was not the destruction of heaven and earth. Well, then I produced from Jeremiah chapter 4, 25 and following, from Zephaniah chapter 1, that the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 was described as the destruction of heaven and earth. Well, his only argument in response to that was, well, here you go, just jumping from one passage to another. Folks, that's not an answer, okay? It's no answer at all. Now, all of that aside, and this just brings us back to proper hermeneutic, that I've shared with you on this program over and over and over again, how important it is that we understand the Hebraic mindset, that we understand, pardon me, the nature of Hebraic literature, Hebraic thought. And so what I've been sharing with you for a good long time now is that Isaiah 2 through 5 truly is about the last days, day of the Lord, of 2 Peter chapter 3. And I've been sharing with you that this day of the Lord of Isaiah chapter 2, and it's actually all the way through chapter 4 and 5, is this great day of the Lord. And I've done that by pointing out, all right, that this great day of the Lord in which men would run to the mountains, they would hide in the caves and say to the rocks, "Fall on us and hide us from the presence of the Lord." Now remember, Jesus applied that very verse to AD 70 in Luke 23, 28 to 31. So the question is, therefore, what right do we have to apply it to anything else? Secondly, Paul quoted from the same identical verses that Jesus applied to AD 70, the verses from Isaiah chapter 2, 19 to 21. Paul quoted from those same identical verses in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. to speak of the coming judgment of the Jews for persecuting the saints. Now, since Jesus applied those very verses from Isaiah to AD 70, and since Paul quoted from the same identical verses from Isaiah that Jesus applied to AD 70, we have the right to ask, where do we get the authorities to say that Paul was speaking of a different day of the Lord from what Isaiah spoke about, which Jesus applied to AD 70? Do you follow this? Do you catch the power of this? Then we have come to Revelation chapter 6. The answer to the prayer of the martyrs who were crying out for vindication. They wanted vengeance. How long, O Lord, do you not avenge us? Greek word ekdekises, a word that is commonly used in reference to the day of the Lord taking vengeance on the ungodly, just like 2 Peter chapter 3, when the Lord would judge the ungodly. Now watch this. The answer to the prayer of the martyrs in Revelation chapter 6 is found in Revelation chapter 6, and I'm going to begin reading with verse 15 for time consideration. The kings of the earth, the great men, the rich men, the commanders, the mighty men, every slave and every free man, watch this, hid themselves in the caves and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. Look, folks, John is quoting Isaiah chapter 2. Follow me once again. Okay? Isaiah is speaking of the last days, day of the Lord, when the Lord would rise to shake the earth mightily. Jesus in Luke 23, 28 to 31, quotes from Isaiah 2, 19 to 21, and applied it to the coming judgment of Jerusalem in AD 70. Paul, in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, 9 and 10, quotes from the exact same verses that Jesus quoted from Isaiah 2, and Jesus applied those verses to AD 70 in the judgment of those who were about to kill him. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, again, Paul quotes from the exact same verses from Isaiah that Jesus quotes from and applied to AD 70. And Paul quotes those verses to speak about the imminent coming of the Lord against the Jews who were persecuting the Thessalonians. So we have Isaiah chapter 2, 19 to 21, that Jesus applies to 70 AD. We have Paul quoting from Isaiah chapter 2, the very verses that Jesus applied to AD 70. Now, in Revelation, we have John quoting from Isaiah chapter 2, and by the way, the parallel of Hosea chapter 8, verse 10. But nonetheless, we have John quoting from Isaiah 2, 19 to 21, from the very verses that Jesus applied to AD 70, the same verses that Paul applied to speak of the impending judgment of Israel, which occurred in AD 70, and we have John quoting those very verses to speak of the coming judgment of those who killed the martyrs. Now, let's take a very, very, very quick trip back to Matthew chapter 23. Standing in the temple, Jesus spoke to the Jews, and he said, "You are those who garnish the tombs of your fathers and of the prophets. And you say, had we been alive in the days of our fathers, we would not have slain the prophets, and you bear witness to yourselves that you are the sons of those who killed the prophets." And Jesus said, Fill up then the measure of your father's guilt. Behold, I send to you prophets, wise men, scribes. Some of them you shall crucify and scourge and chase from city to city, that upon you, folks, could that be any clearer? I'm sorry. Language could not be any clearer. That upon you may come all of the blood of all the righteous shed upon the earth, from righteous Abel unto righteous Zacharias, whom you slew between the temple and the altar. Verily I say unto you, all of these things. All of what things? All of the blood, all the way back to Abel. All of the blood of the prophets slain by Israel. All of these things will come upon this generation. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets and stones those who are sent unto thee, how often I would have gathered you together as a mother hen gathers her chicks, but you would not. Behold, therefore, your house is left to you desolate. Wow. What's Jesus talking about? He is talking about the vindication of the martyrs. What is Revelation 6? What is 2 Thessalonians chapter 1? What is Luke 23, 28 to 31 talking about? The vindication of the martyrs. It's not a radically different subject matter from that of Isaiah chapter 2. How do I know that? Because, as we shall see as we proceed, in that day of the Lord, the day of the Lord when the righteous branch would appear, Isaiah 4, 1 and 2. In that day, the Lord will purge the blood guilt of Jerusalem by the spirit of judgment and the spirit of fire. You catch the power of that? Here is Isaiah's last days, day of the Lord, when the Lord would arise to shake the earth mightily, and it's the day of the Lord when the martyrs would be vindicated in the judgment of Jerusalem. Folks, that is Luke 23, 28 to 31. That is 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. That is Revelation chapter 6. This is the day of the Lord of Isaiah. Now, by the way, as a little sidebar, when we see and we understand that Revelation chapter 6 is citing, quoting verbatim from Isaiah chapter 2 and Hosea, it's Hosea actually chapter 10, not 8, Hosea 10 verse 8, when we understand that it's a prediction of the day of the Lord against Jerusalem for killing the martyrs, then when we come to Revelation, or let me back up a moment, when we see that Jesus applied Isaiah to AD 70, when we see that Paul applied Isaiah to AD 70, and then when we see what Jesus said about the time and the framework for the vindication of the martyrs, then when we see John in Revelation 6 quoting verbatim from the very verses from Isaiah chapter 2 that Jesus applied to the vindication of the martyrs coming up in AD 70, and when we see and realize that Paul quoted from those same identical verses to speak of the impending, imminent judgment on the Jews for persecuting the saints, because after all, as Paul said in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, 14 to 16, Paul said it was the Jews, the Judeans, who had killed the prophets. They've now killed Jesus, and they were killing the apostles and prophets, and they were filling up the measure of their sin. Remember Matthew 23? Do you see who Paul's pointing the finger at? So, when we see John in Revelation chapter 6, quoting from Isaiah, which Jesus applied to AD 70, which Paul applied to AD 70. Guess what that means for the dating of the book of Revelation? Because you see, there's no question whatsoever that in Luke 23, Jesus, quoting from Isaiah, applied that prophecy to the coming in his generation, pardon me, judgment of Jerusalem for killing the martyrs. Now, no one doubts, except the liberal scholars and the skeptics, no one doubts that Jesus was predicting AD 70 before it took place. Okay? Likewise, when we come to 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, virtually all scholars date 2 Thessalonians to approximately 51, maybe as late as 52. So no one doubts when it was written. Well, okay, then that means that Paul was applying Isaiah's prophecy to the coming vindication of the martyrs at the day of the Lord in AD 70. So we have Jesus predicting AD 70 before it occurred. We have Jesus in Matthew 23 predicting vindication of the martyrs in AD 70 before it occurred. We have Paul predicting the vindication of the martyrs that would occur in AD 70, and Paul wrote before AD 70. And now we have John writing the book of Revelation, predicting the imminent, these things must shortly come to pass, the time has drawn near, behold, I come quickly. We have John quoting from Isaiah chapter 2, that Jesus applied to AD 70, that Paul applied to AD 70. And here is John quoting from Isaiah, and everyone wants to tell us, well, yeah, it has nothing to do with AD 70. It's talking about something entirely different. It's talking about our future. Well, then that means that John was applying Isaiah to something radically different from what Jesus did. And that won't work. I'm out of time. I'll see you next week.